Hello there, and welcome back to Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat self-publishing and publishing with some of the leading lights and most interesting figures that we have met in this industry. And today we are delighted to have with us a guest, Collin Glavac, who has written a brilliant trilogy of thrillers and has delved into the fantasy genre. And he is here to talk to us today about research. So, Collin, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting.
Oh, we are very, very happy to have you. And we wouldn't be here, of course, if it wasn't for the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing well, thanks. And welcome, Collin. I think it's funny because you are on here because I was contacted by your dad. And, he was like, oh, my son writes all these books. He just sounded like a huge fan, like your biggest fan, which he should be, right? But then it turns out, like, as I came to find out, that you guys actually worked on that series of thrillers together. So, I think he was just sort of saying that he's just your dad. And I think he said your publisher too, but sounds like he had a bit more involvement in them than just that. So why don't you start off by sort of telling us about how all that works and how you got started with him, and then we can go from there into sort of the idea of how you guys research all the different things in your books that you don't already know about.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So a number of years ago, I think it was, I want to say like 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, my dad offered to take me on a trip to Chicago. He wanted to do kind of a father-son bonding trip. And we were close, but we weren't super, super close at the time. But I said yes and sure and jumped in. Anyway, we went to Chicago. We had a ton of fun. And he said, hey, I know you're trying to get into this writing thing. And I was studying theater at the time as well. I also do some acting. And he said, why don't I kind of produce a show for you. You can be the playwright, you can act in it or whatever and direct it, but I'll help you out. So we put together a show, and then we did another one after that in the Hamilton Fringe. So we did two shows that I acted, wrote, and directed, and then he produced. And then he sat me down after that and said, I've had this idea for a spy thriller that I've wanted to do. I want to do something like, Jason Bourne style stuff. I think that's cool. And would you be willing to do a trilogy? And so we figured out kind of, because there's some of the boundaries, it's kind of difficult working with family and stuff, but we figured out like, okay, I'm the writer, so I've got this much creative license, but I had to write his ideas, right? So the, sort of the initial ideas came from him. And then he wanted it to be set in Latin America was the big draw for him, because he had been getting into Spanish. He had been learning Spanish, and then he had traveled. He'd gone to Guatemala, Nicaragua, Cuba, a few other spots. And he really wanted these books to be like having those elements in them. He wanted to have the regional stuff down pat. He wanted to expose some people to some culture, expose readers to, local religion and things like that, because he was just utterly fascinated by that stuff. And, I became fascinated in that by proxy, but I really wanted to write books. And so it just turned into a really good partnership. And yeah, we just finished the trilogy recently. The third book just went off, and it's really cool to see it come full circle, because that was a number of years ago that all that started.
Yeah, that's great. That's sort of like exactly how I imagine that is. Well, it's probably the best way to do it, right? If you have some kernel of knowledge, then it makes it easier to start with that research. I mean, I imagine if I wanted to write a book about the Latin or Spanish, all that stuff, like all those places that I've never been and have no exposure to, I would probably have a much harder time than someone who at least has had those experiences and has a starting point, knows where it is. Like, I don't know, what would I do? Pick up a map and just pick places and be like, he walked over here. Like, I don't know. So, yeah, that makes sense. That's great.
So, and they always say, write what you know, but it's like, it's a difficult thing, because obviously, unless you're a CIA agent, maybe you are, but it seems like a good balance there. You need to have that kernel and then do the research to actually learn more to fill in the blanks.
Yeah. And I like the thriller genre was not, what I would consider a native genre to me. Like, I'm a sci-fi fantasy nerd, right? Like, I'm you know, I'm growing up with that stuff, and I haven't read that many thrillers, honestly. So I also had to figure out how to write a genre that I was not familiar with or even comfortable with. And then I had to, you know, develop that as I went, which was a really cool experience too. Yeah.
Did you start off reading some thriller books?
You know what? What I did is I started out with tropes, right? I started out with, you know, I was thinking about Jason Bourne, James Bond, you know, all these things that are just in popular culture. And I thought, okay, what do we know about some of these things already? And I worked off of stereotypes to begin with. So I had, you know, a cold-hearted main character, assassin guy. And then I had a bureaucrat guy who was, you know, in doing the behind the scenes stuff. And then I know how different departments step on each other's toes. So I started developing that, and then I made that into a bigger thing than, you know, it probably would be in real life. I made it into like almost, you know, conspiratorial sort of level. And then I had, you know, sexy female agent, whatever. But then I decided to take those things, and I realized that it's actually really hard to write a true stereotype. The stereotypes grow as you're writing them, right? So my sexy female agent became much more than a sexy female agent. She became, you know, one of my favorite characters, really, really clever and really, really cool, and really, really powerful. And my cold-hearted assassin actually ended up having, you know, a bit of a family influence, a bit of a past, you know, that we get to see a little bit of. We get to see a little bit of his family, and his love for culture and things that we wouldn't expect from someone like that. And my bureaucrat really hates red tape, right? So he's always trying to cut through his bureaucracy. So, you know, and they just developed naturally. I don't think that it was out of any sort of really clever moves on my end. I think that just as I wrote these stereotypes, they grew out of being cardboard cutouts into something more, because you're spending time with them, you're writing words, and it's a living document, right? It starts to live and breathe on its own.
Yeah, and that's what you want, right? You don't want to be completely have your book full of stereotypes that everyone's like, oh, here's this one.
Yeah. But I found that a really good starting point. I didn't think that it would be. You know, I was just struggling to get something on the page, and I was like, look, we're just gonna start somewhere. You know, but it ended up being really rewarding in the end, and I wasn't expecting that. So yeah.
You know, from a marketing point of view, that's a really good idea as well. I know a lot of romance authors who are like, okay, I'm going to write a romance book, and we're going to have grumpy sunshine. So it's a grumpy guy and a happy woman, and they're going to have forced shared a bed. So they find some confidence. But you take these, and eventually you write about real human beings who are believable. But having those tropes to start off with makes the book so much more marketable. And I've heard about romance authors doing it, not so much thriller authors. It's kind of a cool thing to hear, and it's a cool idea that I'm putting in the back of my noggin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know romance is big on tropes. I think tropes in you know, multiple genres. You have these tropes that are just so standardized. But it's interesting to see where they take you when you're not, you know, planning on following them through all the way necessarily. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, a lot of authors do it too. And like in the thriller genre, I read a lot of Jack Reacher. He has there's a lot of tropes in those books, but he does a lot of things different than other things. And he actually sometimes calls it out like, oh, you know, this isn't how, you know, Reach is thinking, and so how this isn't how it goes in the movies. And the, you know, movies, you hit a guy in the head and you kill him, you know, like it's not like, you know, and his endings are always like, I don't want to say anticlimactic, because I mean, they're good, but you know, after watching so many spy thrillers where, you know, that final battle always, right, between the bad guy and the good guy, it's always like a long period. With Reacher, it's usually like, you know, he catches the guy, kills him. You know, like it's just like it shoots him. Yeah, done. You know, there's not like this big battle fight. And he's like, and he says that in the thing. He's like, you know, in real life, you just take the shot when you can. You know.
Yeah.
Like in James Bond, where bad guy has all the, you know, the exposition, like, oh, Mr. Bond, I'm going to tell you all of my plans, and then I'm going to have this long drawn out thing.
Yeah, I really respect realism. You know, I said that I'm into sci-fi fantasy reading, and so when I was exposed to the grimdark genre, you know, for fantasy especially, that was something that really changed my perspective on, like, you know, oh, we can get gritty with this, we can get realistic with this, and I've always really appreciated that. and with writing the thrillers, I've often found this fine line between, okay, here's the real thing, but the real thing might not be very interesting. How do I, like, where's the line between going to Hollywood with it, where my readers are going to roll their eyes and be like, that wouldn't actually happen? And where is, okay, this is so real that we don't care. Like I do find there is this right in between, and I try to stay realistic as possible, but I still have to play, and we still have to make it entertaining. We still have to make it interesting to read. So, yeah.
And that's where some of the research is going to come in. It's not all about, and we'll get to this, but it's not all about, the settings and the religion and the local culture, but sometimes it's about the realistic nature of what you're trying to do. Like, he's trying to, and some things ignore this completely, which is a criticism that a lot of thriller novels get, is like, somebody's running beside a plane and they jump on and then it takes off and it gets it. And people are like, that would never happen. You couldn't do that, blah, blah, blah. So you got to research how realistic something is, and then you got to make that decision about whether or not you care.
Yeah,
still
totally.
want to serve the story, right? But so let's start off with these books. So your dad wanted to do them in a certain culture because he has the background. So how did that all get started? Was he just like, okay, let's set this one in this place and here's some stuff, or like, did he, and then you'd be like,
kinda,
okay,
right? Like,
yeah.
kind of. He had learned the language. He learned Spanish, and he learned it well enough that he was fluent, and then he really got into the culture and stuff. And he'd watch these videos and immerse himself that way. But eventually, then he traveled to these places, and then I would ask him something like, okay, where is this going to take place? And he'd say, okay, it's going to take place in like Antigua is the first place. And then I would say, okay, send me a document with like just some notable things. Like, what are some things that you would kind of want to see in this book, or what are some things that are notable enough about Antigua that I should definitely be mentioning? And then I would try and look at my plot, and then I'd be like, okay, if John needs to get from A to B, maybe he can pass by the Antiguan Arch, right? Like, maybe he can, and then I can do a little historical spiel. I think Dan Brown does this well, right? Where he's constantly working in action alongside his research of history, right? Which I think is really cool.
Sure.
And so I would say, John walks by the Antiguan, or under the Antiguan Arch, and the Antiguan Arch was, this place where this happened. And then I would be able to kind of fulfill both sides of that coin. And then I would sort of tick that off the list, right? Be like, okay, I got that one done. Now, where else can I fit these other things? The interesting thing is when it happens the other way around. I would write something like, the guy came up to him and he was wearing yada, yada, yada and long pants. And then Dad will read the draft and say, no one wears pants. No Latin American wears pants in Latin America. And that's something I would have no idea with. Like, that should not be, that is not something we would think of just as an average, I'm in North America.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's just, or sorry, the other way around. I think I was writing about them wearing shorts because I had assumed, so even I'm getting it wrong now, it was that they don't wear shorts even though it's hot, is the idea, is that they wear these long pants. And I was just like, it's just something I wouldn't think of. So that was really cool.
I was going to say, everyone in Latin America doesn't wear pants. I'm like, this is new information.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that might be Brazil, right? I've heard that. So yeah, that's exactly the important part of research, I think, is that local flavor, because anybody can, pull up Wikipedia and read a few things and then stick them in, right? But if you haven't been there, or you don't know somebody who's there, or you don't have beta readers that are from there, it might be hard to get that sort of thing right, because it's just not something, I don't remember ever reading, people in Latin America don't wear shorts. Like, I mean, that's just not something you would necessarily know unless you've done some research, gone there, talked to somebody who's been there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's totally the kind of thing that I think that's important. Like, I remember we went on a trip to, we went on a cruise once, and we went to, I don't remember which little tiny island it was, like St. Lucia, I think maybe it was. And, on the cruise, they give you the excursions. You got to pay, you pay, and they take you on to really the tourist spots, right? Go swim with dolphins or something. It's like, how does that tell me anything about this place that I'm in, right? You could do that anywhere. So one time in St. Lucia, we actually went to a cab driver, and we just said, take us around the city, like where you live, where you go to the market, where you do stuff. And we actually got to see a part of that island that I don't think any of the tourists normally would see, because they're going to completely different areas. And that's, if I was writing something about that, I would want to write about, right? Because I wouldn't want to be like, oh, write about all these touristy areas. I want to write about the real, St. Lucia or wherever it is. Yeah. So I think that's good that, that he had been there.
Yeah. And that is, I owe lots to my father for, publishing and marketing and doing that side of things, because that's our partnership. But that extra research flavor is I think one thing that we really have in our pockets that make these books a little more unique than they could have been. Not everyone knows a ton about Latin America. I don't know how many other stories or the other thrillers are taking place in Latin America, and there is a history of the CIA sort of meddling in Latin American affairs, which made it kind of extra spicy for us to work with.
Right. So for the research, in terms of that, you would just, I guess, ask him, and then if he didn't know, where would you go next?
Yeah, so we did have, like, so for example, the language piece, although he's fluent, he's not a native speaker, right? So he would have, he'd find someone online to, double check our Spanish. So it would start, the first step is I would Google, Spanish swear words or whatever it is that I'm putting in there. I put them in, then Dad reads them, then he changes them, then he gets a fluent, native speaker from online who says, well, yeah, technically you could say this, but okay, it has to be changed a little bit that way. There are some things that admittedly, you kind of have to accept at a certain point and be like, look, I did my best here. I've been called out on a few things, right? I'm not, the biggest one is, like, I'm not a military guy. I don't have military background. I don't have a lot of military contacts. I have one guy who checks my gun stuff to make sure that, my AK-47 doesn't sound stupid or whatever, that I'm using proper, like, lingo. But I did have, like, I've gotten angry emails from people being like, you called this guy this form of officer, or you capitalize this when it shouldn't be. And it's like, at a certain point, I have to be like, look, I am still just a writer. I am still just a guy, with a keyboard trying to make things up. Like, I don't work for the CIA, like, there's only so much I can say, and you can get away with a bit, especially with clandestine stuff, because you can be like, oh, well, I don't know if you really know that because it's the CIA. How would anyone know? Like, you can kind of fib a little. So I get away with some stuff that way. But, like, at a certain point, it's like, if you put in the work, I had a professor who told me this once, and I really take it to heart. It's like, if you put in the work and you do your best, then you really have nothing to worry about. Like, at a certain point, you have to let the thing live, and other people will, give me that criticism, and I can always make edits. I can always make those changes and say, hey, you're right. Thanks for pointing that out. I'll change up the PDF and upload it. Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah. That's one of the big benefits, right, of an ebook. We've talked about that before. You can just go make the edit, re-upload, and be like, okay, now it's fixed.
Yeah.
But the thriller genre in particular, the people are incredibly discerning. It's like, in romance, I remember mentioning to one romance writer, it's like, oh, you got a CIA agent in DC, CIA are like outside of America, and she was like, my readers don't care. Whereas in the thriller industry, it's like, yeah, they care about these details a lot. I remember one guy writing an angry email because somebody had a screw-on silencer for their MP5, and it's like, that's actually an MP5A5 or whatever, and it's like, these little details matter to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I'm blessed in that regard, that I don't think a lot of my readers are reading my books for, the hardcore sort of military references that I'm making. I think that they might call me out on the Latin American stuff before they would call me out on that other stuff. And that stuff is the stuff that I'm more trying to get right first. I'm okay going a little Hollywood on the gun stuff. I don't want to go too Hollywood on, Latin American culture. Like, I really don't want to get that wrong, because that's a real thing that we're trying to portray accurately. Yeah. So again, like, a little bit of give and take, and I think a lot of my readers, I think there's a lot of grace, when they read these. They're like, look, it's entertainment first. There's these cool research elements, these cool regional pieces, and then we can talk about how a proper paratrooper lands last, hopefully.
Right. Yeah. There's so many things that you probably don't even know that you don't know as well, right? That you wouldn't even think to check. Like a proper paratrooper landing. If I was writing that, I wouldn't even think twice about it. I'd be like, he landed, you know? Like I wouldn't even know if there was a right way to do it or a wrong way until somebody, you know, called me out on it.
Yeah.
That's part of it, I guess. Knowing what to research. Oh, I lose you. Oh. Yeah, knowing what to research is I think sometimes half the battle, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I sometimes don't think of that, but it's like, what is the priority here? You know, and my priority, I've argued with people about this before, but you know, my first priority is just to tell a coherent story. Like that's the first thing. Can I make this thing make sense? And I think that's a lot harder than I think it's a very difficult thing, quite frankly, because I'm all over the place a lot of the time. And then that accuracy. Yeah.
And I think you chose kind of a harder genre than maybe some others. Like we were saying, how you're writing sci-fi or fantasy novels next, right? And that,
Yeah.
especially if it's magic based, which I think yours are,
Yeah.
there's more latitude. You're kind of making stuff up, right?
Yeah. I have found I like it's writing. It's totally different writing experience. The advantage is when you're writing something like a thriller, it takes place in the real world, you know, so it's easy for me to be like, okay, if he needs to get somewhere, he takes a car. Like I know how to do that. If I was writing a, you know, high medieval fantasy, you know, you have to go through the difficulty of being like, okay, is this a horse? Is it a carriage? Or can they walk? You know, what are the distances? You know, all that stuff, which I find challenging. So thrillers are nice in that respect, where you can do stuff kind of in that contemporary setting and that contemporary way. On the other hand, yeah, you're absolutely right. When with the magic, you can play fast and loose and make up your own rules. Be like, all right, all demons are going to be this way. All right, great. Let's have some fun with that. You know.
Yeah. And if you're making up your own world as opposed to sort of like an urban fantasy or whatever, where it's in sort of in the real world, then the geography doesn't matter either. You know, you make it up as you go along, you draw a little map at the end, put it in the front of the book, and you're done, right?
And you know what? Sometimes it leads to like really big plot problems. Like I'll give you one that happened in Cuban Conspiracy. So I wrote this sick graveyard scene where you know, without spoiling too much, there's a bunch of grave digging going on, and there's this it's a really cool scene. And Dad was like, yeah, this is really cool, but that's not how graves work in Cuba. They go in a like a coffin, and then they sort of sit in like a tomb. Like it's not like you pop the lid off a tomb, and it's not actually like you don't dig through the dirt and then bury someone like that in you know. So I had to suddenly, and I was like, oh, but this affects the way that these characters are going to fight because yada yada yada. And so I had to, you know, change that. So the culture like sometimes informs the plot, right? And the plot sometimes informs the culture, which I think is so important. Someone told me a long time ago, they said, you know, if you're having something take place in, you know, any kind of setting, the setting becomes a character, right? And that really happens with Latin America, like whether it takes place in Guatemala or Nicaragua or Cuba throughout the series, that place becomes a character that informs our character choices. What are they able to do? You know, are they able to bribe these guards or no? You know, are they able to talk to someone of a different station? You know, so on and so forth.
That's really interesting. And I think the other thing with the thrillers, what I found so interesting about your trilogy is that there's a lot of stuff that people aren't necessarily aware of, in which the CIA got involved in like stuff in Latin America. And like, even though what you write is fiction, a lot of what you talk about is stuff that does then lead into people finding out more about the real life history of American involvement in the South and stuff. So I guess that's kind of like a burden that you have when you are not writing, you know, fantasy stuff. You're writing about real places, real people, real cultures, and also our influence on those cultures.
Sure. Yeah. So the last book I really wanted to dedicate to people of Latin America, because you know, we've been in this setting for so long, and I wanted to sort of acknowledge that I'm in this setting that is not, you know, is not my own. And I feel like a guest, I'm like a guest writer, writing that region, that culture, and that. And I'm hoping that brings an interest from people who are not from that region to be excited about that place. That would be really nice. Yeah.
Oh, I think it
Like
would
spark
for
some
sure.
tourism. Yeah.
I think that, I like what you had said about the setting becomes its own character. I think that's a good point, and it's tough to get that right if you're not from there. I mean, like we were saying with your fantasy stuff, and you could drive in a car on the thrillers, and then fantasy you take a horse and whatever, but you're making up the destinations as you go if it's in your own world or whatever. Sometimes with that local, when you're setting something locally, you kind of have to almost know the area well, especially if people are sort of traveling a small town or area, right? Because there might be like, do you take the main roads, or with the local people know you'd always take these side roads and you'd run down these alleys. I always, when I was writing romance, I would almost never specify the city that I was in because I just didn't want to get things wrong and have people sending me emails like, oh, it's not how, that's not like, what am I going to do? Pick up a map and be like, okay, this street connects to this. Like, so I mean, I get it. A lot of people will, if they live in New York, all their books will be in New York, and then they can really get that local flavor. Right. But I always felt I wanted them to be sort of US based, but I'm in Canada, so I didn't know enough about it to write about, so it was always super generic. But
yeah, I find so I let the reader fill in a bunch with their imagination. So if you just say this takes place somewhere, then they can kind of picture a bunch of things, and then if you can just I try and find like just a bunch of like big like iconic things. And then what I do is to get the little stuff is I often will like just look up on Google Maps, and then I'll like mention a street. And then, that kind of like people are like, oh, wow, like you must know this place pretty good because you mentioned the street. And it's like, well, it's not hard just to look up and just find a street. It's harder when, again, like what I need my dad for is to call me out on the things that are like really obtuse. Like, again, I just remembered I had this other plot hole. I had this really cool beach fight, it happens in the water and all this really cool stuff is happening, and the dad is like this is a landlocked city. Like there is no beach like anywhere, like we do not have a lake, like we don't have anything. So I was like, okay, I guess we're gonna have a stuff like that has to sometimes happen. But yeah, I find what I would do, I especially did this in Nicaragua in particular, is I had a map open almost all the time because there was a bunch of like chases and a bunch of like places where they're traveling on a highway, and they were going through all these like different student barricades because they're protesting the government, and so I was following along like where these barricades would kind of generally be, and then like how to get to the airport and like stuff like that. And I just mapped it all. I just followed the map, and then I would just I would write all that, and then I would double check with dad. And I think there was one time he said, oh, it would make more sense to take this street, or this street isn't referenced that way, it would be referenced this way. But other than that, we were able to actually have like a logic map thing. But you're right, it makes it way more complex. It's a lot, anytime things get more complex, there's more room for error. I had to be doing like distances and times, which becomes very, very frustrating because if you have time sensitive things, or if you have switching perspectives, how long is this guy chasing them in a helicopter for? Okay, well, they've gotten 10 kilometers on this highway so far, I guess, because that's how far the airport is from this point. Oh God, what a mess.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I really hits home with me is like, if you're writing a book where you have to do a lot of research about this sort of thing, it's almost like you really need to have either somebody you can talk to. If you don't know it yourself, you need somebody you can talk to who does. You need beta readers that do, or just people that are willing to have a look at your book. And I think most authors that do a lot of research do have these contacts. But for people that are thinking about it, I can't stress enough that I think that's one of the most important things, because just in those two examples you gave with like the grave scene and the beach scene, those are just things that like you would just write because it's a cool scene, and you wouldn't even think that doesn't make sense, and till somebody who reads it would be like, that's obvious, you should have known that. And it's not even something you would have thought to look up. Like I wouldn't have thought, oh, I'm writing a cemetery scene. Let me make sure Latin America has cemeteries. Like, I mean, I don't know. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's
Totally.
And it makes it. I wrote. I've never been to Las Vegas, but I'm familiar with American culture because I live in America, and I wrote a book, and I did the same thing as you with Google Maps. I was doing a car chase, so I was basically doing the car chase in Google Maps, and then someone said, "It's like, oh wow, it's like I was really there," which made me feel good. But there are other times, and I think the people who are familiar with places find that annoying. I've got Paris in my background. I used to live in Paris. I watch movies all the time where like the heroine arrives in Paris and she drives past the Champs-Elysees and then the Eiffel Tower and then the Musée d'Orsay, and I'm like, none of those places are anywhere near each other. This is a completely fictional route. Where is your taxi driver taking you? And these things matter to the people who they matter to.
Yeah, I think one thing we have to ask ourselves as writers is, why are we writing that setting, or why are we writing that research? Why is that important? And again, thinking about the setting as a character that informs us, or thinking about the research that then impacts the plot or what a character might do, or even give a plot twist, right? Those things are, I think, so important because they justify why you have that research in the first place. And it's more integrated, right? So you don't have research that is separate from your other story elements. Like, it all should work together, ideally, right? It's not always that easy. I definitely struggle with that, but when those things come together, it's like chef's kiss, right? Beautiful.
Yeah. And it's a different kind of research that you have to do when it's, like we were saying, like when it's based in reality like this or fantasy. But that doesn't mean there isn't research to do in fantasy. Like you were saying about, how long it would take you to get there on horseback or on foot or whatever. But, a lot of fantasy is written in sort of like medieval kind of times, right? And so you might need to do research in that, even if you're setting it in a fictional world, you still kind of want to get some things like accurate in the sense that like you're not going to have things that just don't make any sense, even in a fictional world, like why you wouldn't have that, like, and everybody's so, and then the magic system and stuff like that, you're making it all up, right? But you have to maybe not research, but you have to certainly plan out how it all works so that it all makes sense, right? And in your world, right? So you can't just make it up as you go along, right?
Yeah.
I guess you'd have to be.
I found these challenges. Yeah.
You'd have to be more, I think, of when you're doing a book like this with a lot of research, I imagine it would be far more beneficial to be a plotter rather than a pantser. That's my thought on it. What do you think? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. So I guess you're a pantser.
Oh God. I am a pantser. I am such a mess that I even write out of order. So I wrote, I'll write chapter 10. It will be the third chapter that I write. I don't know. Like, there's some things that I'm like, I don't know how much I should when I talk publicly about my books, right? But I actually wrote like one of my big action scenes in the first book. It was like one of the second or third scenes I wrote because Dad, like, I wrote a few chapters and Dad was like, this is kind of boring. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm trying. And then I went to my computer in a rage at sometime like late at night, and I wrote this action scene. And I didn't know why the people were fighting, but I was like, these people are gonna fight, and there's gonna be a conflict. And I wrote this whole thing, and then I gave it to Dad, and then he was like, "This is great." I was like, "I will justify it later," and I did. Later on, I put in a little side thing, and then this guy's in his office being like, "Oh, these guys attacked us, and we have to do this, this, and this." I'm like, "Great!" Explains it. It's done. It fits into the story. Copy paste chapter 10 into the middle of the book. Great. Like, I just have all these sticky notes everywhere that web things together. I'm a little bit more organized now in Operation Nicaragua, which is the second book. Dad actually put together a really helpful outline because he had this like vision for the book. He was like, I think this is kind of what happens. So I took that and then I messed around with it and I added a bunch of stuff. In Cuban Conspiracy, neither of us really knew where it was going to go. But one thing that I did near the end of the book is I went back and like inserted a bunch of research because I actually felt that I felt like there was a couple things that just weren't flavorful enough. And so I went back in and I was like, hey, I can do more with this scene. Or, oh, John, it says that John drives over here. You know, what's a landmark that I can insert there? You know, there are things like that as a writer, we sometimes forget in that editing process, especially, or in multiple drafts, how you can I call it cheating, quite frankly, where you can go back into your work and you know, like insert stuff. And then when you publish it, it looks like it's been there the whole time. You know, you guys have probably heard that quote from Neil Gaiman where he says, editing is just making it look like you knew what you were doing the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Writing that second draft, right? So, you know, take advantage of that, but with research, right? Specifically with research, you can just insert stuff and you can find better places for things.
Yeah, no, for sure. You want to, I mean, I'm sure even when you're plotting, there's going to be stuff that you write later in the book and you're going to think, I could probably set this up a little better earlier if I mentioned this, or if I, you know, especially in a thriller, it's like all of a sudden he's in some situation that maybe he planned, you know, he's in a locked cage and needs to escape. And, oh, if only he had like a penknife or something, and then be like, oh,
Yeah.
well, let me go back to chapter 2 and be like, oh, and he got his penknife and put it in his shoe or whatever, you know, like, so yeah, I don't think it's cheating. It's like you said, it's editing, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the whole thing. A book at the end of the day is like a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? It's like Neil Gaiman said, the first draft is you telling yourself the story. Then the second draft is making it look like you did it on purpose. And sometimes it is a case of putting the pieces in, and then it's like, okay, that piece actually belongs there. It's quite a convoluted and beautiful thing when you think about how stories are assembled. And the research is so important because it just wins over that authenticity. So we're nearly actually approaching the top of the hour. So I was going to quickly say, Collin, what is your advice if someone is writing a story and they're concerned about the level of authenticity in it? What is your advice to them about how to go around researching it?
Yeah, I think so. A few things. I think one of them is, first of all, recognize that your readers have a bit of grace, right? So I would hate for someone to be, you know, passionate and excited to write something and then say, oh, readers are going to challenge me on this, I shouldn't even try. It's like, no, readers will give you a chance, you know, to do that. So take that chance and do it first. You know, readers want to read something good. They're excited to read. So, you know, try and deliver that. The next thing is, you know, give it an honest shot, and just look stuff up, and slowly you will find different things connected. So when I was doing research on Cuban cemeteries, right, I found this really cool blog about like death in Cuba, and I started reading that, and you know, so your research will take you to different areas, and you will start absorbing stuff, you know, even from your initial place. You will be able to kind of go down that rabbit hole and find other stuff that then is more than just Wikipedia, right? You'll be able to find those enhanced experiences. And then I think the last thing is, if possible, try and get someone as close to the source as possible. So in my case, obviously, my dad, but even we have people double checking our language, or I have my gun guy, you know, who's my lovely neighbor Dave. You know, people helping you out. It doesn't have to be just you. It doesn't have to just be you in this war of, I have to figure this all out and I have to know all this stuff. It's like, no, like there might be people on your side that you can use, like beta readers or whatnot, or people that you can find online and just double check something. I mean, I've heard other authors, you know, post in forums before. Actually, I was on Reddit looking up a translation of Cuban Santeria like deities, and the Orisha versus Oricha, and like there was a debate on Reddit, and I just read the Reddit post, and you know, that was just informative. So yeah, I think those are some things that I would say. But I would really hate someone to be so intimidated by, you know, setting somewhere unique that then they would shy away from it completely. I think it's worth a shot.
Absolutely. Well, that is fantastic advice. Craig, do you have any more questions before we wrap things up?
No, I agree. It's great advice. I think, like I said, I agree completely that having people to run some of this stuff by is super key, because my biggest fear of all this is not necessarily like the research being done right of the stuff that I thought to research, but more about the stuff that I didn't think to research, that I didn't realize was not a thing. I remember in one book I had, I just wrote something about some kind of food. It was a Chinese food dish that we have here, chicken balls with this glowing red sauce. Right? Roland, you have no idea. I can see by your face, right?
Yeah.
I had no idea that's a Canadian thing, or it's a Canadian Chinese food thing. Right? Yeah, exactly. So I had that in there, and then I had some people say to me, "What is this thing you're talking about?" I'm like, "What do you mean? It's chicken balls. Everybody eats chicken balls. Like that's like everybody eats chicken balls here in Canada, and they have the glowing red sauce or orange sauce, and everybody knows that." But I had no idea that wasn't a thing in the U.S., or at least not in a bunch of places in the U.S. Until somebody said to me, "Yeah, that's not a thing." It's always those things that you don't even think of that are going to trip you up, I think, right?
And those are the details that really, really make things pop, though.
Yeah.
So, Collin, where can people find your books?
Yeah, I mean, the best place is probably Amazon. That's the place that most people go to grab my stuff. But we are wide, so we should be at your favorite bookseller. You can do a little search. If you Google my name, if you Google the books, you should be able to find it anywhere.
That is fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think this has been a really, really interesting conversation. And it's funny we hadn't touched on research before, considering it's such like a cornerstone, especially in like the thriller genre. So hopefully people watching this have found this a very interesting discussion. And if you have, make sure to leave Collin a comment down below and hit that like button, whether you're listening to us as a podcast or on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. So Collin, thank you very much. Craig, we will be back again next week with another episode of Fully Booked. Stay tuned.